Good morning. This is Bill from Curious Cars, and today from Autohaus of Naples on a miserable, well, you know what, it isn't that bad yet. I mean, it's probably in the low 70s, high 60s. It's muggy, it's misty, I've got water dripping on me, it's foggy. You can just tell it's a horribly humid Florida December morning, and it just is not at all what I want. You know, we wait for all 9 months of miserable summer to get a few good months of chilly or cooler weather, and at the moment it's just not happening. We're getting all this warmer than usual weather while the rest of the country is cold, and it just absolutely sucks. I'm miserable about it, and I have high hopes for the next couple of weeks. It's supposed to get a little bit cooler, but as of today, you know, you can just tell, even if the morning is fairly decent, by noon it's going to be crappy, tropical, and hot, and that's just the way it goes. I am very happy today to have this 1993 Saab 900 convertible. This is what's called the Classic 900. It's a car that's very near and dear to my heart. For one reason, because my dad owned one back in 1984, which I grew up with, and made a big, you know, kind of a big impact on me. And I'm very happy to have it today. You know, even with the coronavirus whiskey in full effect, I kind of look at this thing and I'm charmed and I'm happy and I'm chipper because it's just nice to have a Saab. And I understand that, you know, the bulk of the cars that I like are American or weird or Mercedes or that sort of thing. And the Saab doesn't really fit in. And if my dad hadn't bought one back then, I probably wouldn't understand it the way that I do. But I am one of the Saab geeks, and there are a bunch of them out there. There's a real cult following for these things, and frankly, because of my experience with them, I kind of understand it. This one is finished in ruby red over kind of a satin leather interior, which is nice. Honestly, I'd probably prefer a coupe if I had the choice, but the convertible works well for Florida, and at least it does have a manual gearbox, so we'll get into all of that as we go. But we'll start with Saab. It is, or at least it was, a fascinating car company. No question about that. I mean, Saab was uniquely different from just about everything out there. I mean, famously, it was founded to make airplanes, basically for the Swedish military in the lead up to World War II. Sweden decided that they wanted to maintain their neutrality. They would need warplanes to do it. They already had a pretty good industry thing going with trucks and tanks and that sort of thing. And they thought, you know, well, why the hell shouldn't we build airplanes instead of buying them from other countries? And so they did. And they formed this company called Saab to make them in the late 30s, I want to say in 1937. And that would give the future car company that Saab became sort of this endless shtick for advertising with jet airplanes, something that ended up working well for them. But it was more than just a shtick, really, because there was some truth to it. I mean, the airplane engineering did make its way into the cars. They also merged with a truck company called Scania, and that company's engineering also made its way into the cars, as did the logo. So Saab, again, was a fairly interesting thing. The name Saab, to me, is a bit of a disappointment. You know, it sounds cool. It's Saab. It was kind of like Haagen-Dazs ice cream when I found out that was just some stupid corporate made-up thing. I thought there was, you know, two guys named Haagen-Dazs, or at least one, you know, making fancy ice cream. Well, it turns out like Nestle or whoever just thought the name sounded cool. And to some extent, that's the same story with Saab. Basically, the company's name, when translated from the original Swedish, it's just an acronym for Swedish Airplane Company. I mean, you really can't get any more banal than that. And it gets worse because their first car was the 92, which we'll get into in a minute. But I always thought that Saab's use of nines, you know, nines played heavily into all there was the 900, the 92, the 99, the 96, and I thought it was kind of cool and exotic. But it turns out that Saab's first car, the 92, was named because the 91 was sequentially the model before the 92. The 91 was a single-engined airplane, by the way, a trainer. And that was the 91st product they'd made. And the 92 then became a car. So what I thought was kind of cool and exotic and interesting turned out to just be, some Swedish accountant's good bookkeeping, which, oh, God, what are you going to do? And, it reminds me of that Yes album, 90125. When I was a kid, basically, that came out. And I thought, wow, what a cool name. It must have some numerical meaning for something kind of sexy or exotic or, 90125. Well, it turns out that was just the generically assigned album number that was given to the Yes album. And the band liked it. They thought it sounded cool. So they named the album that. And, Saab sort of has the same sort of thing going. There was no Professor Saab who, started the company out of his garage building cool advanced cars from a vision. It was just sort of a big generic corporate state typical Swedish communist thing where they just started building airplanes and, then the war ended and they had all these factories and people and then, well, what are we going to do with them? We don't need warplanes as much anymore. Well, let's just start building cars. So that's the way Saab came to fruition. So it's just banal as hell when you look at it without, sort of getting into the Swedish naming of things. But, even if the names were a little bit banal, the cars themselves weren't, starting with the first one. So they, right after the war, they started building these things. It was the Project 92. In maybe 48, they had come up with 4 prototypes called the Ursaabs, URSAAB. And again, it sounds a little exotic, but basically it just stands for Original Saab. I mean, the minute you start translating these things, you get bored to hell. But that's what it was. And the next year, that Saab, the Saab, became the base for the Production 92. And that car was different from just about anything else on the road. And that's something that would follow Saab all through the next few decades. It was extremely aerodynamic because, again, it was built by airplane engineers at a time when aerodynamics weren't really a thing. It was incredibly slippery. I think it had a drag coefficient of like 0.30, which was just light years beyond anything else going around at the time. And it just developed sort of a very quick cult following within Scandinavia. They weren't really sold outside of there. Very quickly, I'll point this out. Even if these cars are sort of boring in names and designs or whatever, the emblem isn't. That's a red griffin or griffin, which is sort of a mythological creature with a head of a lion and the body of a bird. And it was actually from Scania, not from Saab itself. It actually only first appeared on the cars in 1984, but they became very protective of that logo and only leased it to GM. Ended up not continuing on into the future. It was also the name of one of their fighter planes, which ended up in the ads. Actually, in the Second World War, like 7 of Hitler's V-2 rockets were launched into Sweden by accident and crash landed. They were recovered by the army. They were handed over to Saab airplane engineers who sort of reverse engineered them, took them apart. And there's some talk that, it didn't, there was a Swedish missile program which was going on. And of course, the V-2 rockets factored heavily into that. But there's a story that some of that technology also ended up in the original Saab products for cars, and that may well be true. So the only thing I can say for sure is that Swedish Missile sounds a little bit like a cheesy porn movie or something. But anyway, they started making cars at a company site in Trollhättan. Love the whole troll thing with the Saabs. In 1947, they started putting them together. They came up with the Ursaab thing, and in 1949, they released the 92. So that would be the beginning of what would become a very interesting car company. That was a 2-cylinder, 2-stroke engine, which was kind of ridiculous, but it worked well. Soon they added another cylinder to that. They made it the Saab 93 with a 3-cylinder engine. I mean, Saab had some really strange engines over the year. And then a couple of years later, they came out with the Model 94 Sonnet, which was their first sports car. That was released in 1956, and it looked a little bit like a scared Corvette on a hunger strike. It was just a strange-looking car. In 1959, in a state, a wagon came out called the 95. But 1960 was a turning point. They released the Model 96. It was still based on the original 92, but it had been fleshed out a little bit. And they exported it. It started to make its way into the UK and other European points of interest, and they sold 500,000 of them. And they developed a very, very dedicated fan base who loved what they were. I mean, it had this 3-cylinder, 2-stroke engine, which basically meant you had to add 2-stroke engine oil to the gas to make it run. It sounded like a big leaf blower going down the road. But it was very well built, very solid. It was unique. It wasn't like any other car. Very durable. It handled well. It was doing extremely well in motorsports. They actually finished, I think, first in their class in Le Mans in the one year, and I don't remember what 1950s Saab finished first, but it did. And mostly, though, in the rally competitions. Of course, Sweden is a freezing Scandinavian country, and these cars were built for that. And they did quite well in the snow and bad traction conditions, and as a result, they did quite well in rally racing. And that success would end up being one of the standards that Saab used in their advertising, and one of the vehicles, not car vehicles, but vehicles, which sort of led them to have some success down the road because people were impressed at how they raced. So, very, very cool stuff. Basically, it was a cleverly designed, high-quality, economically proper, well-made car that just made people happy. And, you know, much later, GM found themselves incapable of translating that into mass production. But we'll get into that as we go. The next car that came out was the Model 99 in 1967, and that was a huge step forward for Saab. It was the first all-new Saab in about 20 years. You know, every other car before that was sort of based on that original 92. Well, this one wasn't. It was all different. It was a clean break from that design. It had innovations and features that would come to define Saab for decades. It had a wraparound windscreen, self-repairing bumpers, headlamp washers, side impact door beams, heated seats, and other features. It was very unique and groundbreaking at the time. And in fact, it was designed by a guy named Sixten Sayson. I'm sure I'm not saying his name wrong, but I have no concept of how Scandinavian names are pronounced. And it was unique and groundbreaking. And it was the first Saab to use that sort of hockey stick design, which was, it was a profile which looked a little bit like a hockey stick around the rear C-pillar windows. That was sort of Saab's version of BMW's Hofmeister Kink. And it would continue into future designs and become a hallmark of the company. It also brought one of the first instances of the passenger car having sort of a turbocharged engine that wasn't exotic. I mean, the Porsche 930 Turbo had beat it out in 1976, but that was a much more racy application, much more touchy, and in fact, that car was lethal, as you know, some lawyers were able to find out. It killed a lot of orthodontist wives at the time. Saab took that turbo technology and made it much more accessible and much more common, and they made it work in the 99 in a way that people liked. And as a result, turbos would become another thing to sort of define the company. But their widespread success in racing was a big part of promoting their cars as reliable, sporty, and durably high quality. And that was the reputation that Saab was developing, and it would serve them very, very well. that became the Saab 900, which was basically a variation of the 99. I mean, from the front of the front doors back, it was essentially identical to the 99. Uses the same windows, the same hatch, the same glass. From the fender forward, it was a little bit different. It was stretched out, and we'll get into why as we go. But the 900, this car, was an absolute breakthrough for Saab, and it was the beginning of them reaching the mainstream. Before the 900, they found some success everywhere. You know, in Europe, people liked them. They were very good cold weather cars. In America, they were exclusively owned by sort of pointy-headed liberals. I mean, which doesn't really include me. But, you know, if you were a professor at Dartmouth or something, you couldn't drive a Mercedes. You may or may not have had the money, but you couldn't drive one because it was just too, snazzy. You couldn't really drive an American car because it didn't separate you. So you had to go to a Saab or a Volvo. And if you remember, McGovern lost to Nixon by a giant margin, like by 70-30 or something, but like 100% of Saab buyers at the time voted for him. So it was a very, very liberal car. But what the 900 did was sort of bring Saab more into the mainstream. You had the malaise era in American cars, which was really turning off American buyers. People who had traditionally bought American cars were disgusted by what they were finding. The cars were cookie cutter, they were low quality, the engines weren't great, nothing was great. They had to start looking in different directions. The luxury car buyers went to Mercedes or BMW. The middle-of-the-road buyers, quite a few of them found Volvo and Saab, and that sort of led to their success in the 1980s, and probably what made GM find them so attractive towards the end of the 1980s. Well-equipped 900 started selling to yuppies. It became a thing, Saab wasn't in and of itself a luxury car maker, but the cars that they started producing in the United States were touching that. They were sort of competing with BMW and Mercedes without really having the same sort of high-end accoutrements, and the yuppies found them interesting. They liked the turbo, they liked the design, they liked the aircraft lineage, we'll get into the design of the car as we go in a minute, but anyway, they found it appealing, and that led to Saab starting to have some genuine success. They decided to have a collaboration with Fiat, and they came up with the Saab 9000. Which was released in the mid-'80s and was supposed to be their first sort of true luxury car, and that's probably when GM really started noticing them. Well, the 9000 didn't sell very well, even though it was kind of a cool car. The 900 was ancient by that time, even though it sort of sold incrementally better every year all the way through 1987 before it started declining, but it was getting pretty old in the tooth. And then by 1989 they were running into financial troubles, and that's when GM swooped in and ended up buying half the company with an option to buy the other half later, which they did take. So down the road GM owned, they ended up owning all of it. But it was still a fascinating time, and it was enough that my dad bought one in 1984. I'll never forget it. It was this sort of azure blue stripper 900. It had window cranks, it had a 5-speed, it had no serious options at all. It had like an AM radio, but obviously there was enough of a buzz about that car for my sort of a father who really wasn't hip and up on these things to go out and buy one. So, Saabs were making a name for themselves. David E. Davis, the editor of Car and Driver at the time, a very cool cat, he had some fascinating things to say about Saab when, he drove them. He said, basically the Saab 900 was like, well, it was like a Mercedes-Benz went out and did some acid and had a bad acid trip and changed its character and never really came back and became something different. And that it was a car that, you, your wife, your kids could drive, sporty, reliable, durable. very proper, and also used to evade the police if you needed to. So, again, Saab just had sort of an interesting, unique vibe to it that was absolutely fascinating. In '89, GM ended up buying them. Later on, you'd get the 9.3, the 9.5. They were based on GM products. I'm not going to say that they became terrible. There were still some unique Saabs. And in fact, part of the reason Saab ultimately failed was that they just couldn't conform themselves into the total GM cookie cutter approach. They really tried to maintain their own identity, and that was a big part of what ruined them. But that said, the Saab 900 truly is the last proper 100% classically designed Saab. So that's where I'm going to end the history. I'm not going to get into all the weird electric shit they have going on now, all the fights they had with Spiker, and Koenigsegg and the Chinese companies and GM hoarding its technology and, all that other stuff. It's great and it's interesting history, but the truth of the matter is, in '94, with the death of the Saab 900, it might have carried on in other countries past that, but '94 was the last U.S. model. The end of the 900 was basically the end of true Saab, and that's the last of them. So I tell you what, I'm going to pause there for a minute, get my shit together, and then we're going to dive into this particular car. So hold on one moment. All right, so look, let's get into the design of the car first. It was put together by a guy named Bjorn and Wahl. He was a, Scandinavian cat who was, head of design at Saab and tasked with creating the 900, out of the 99, which was basically the same car. But the way that he did it was kind of interesting. So, first of all, it looked like nothing else on the road at the time. It was designed with aerodynamics in mind, and of course so were other cars, but not to the extent that Saab was, and certainly not with the same, and I hate saying it because it sounds so cliched, but with the same aircraft style engineering. First of all, you've got this big overhang in the front, and we'll get into why. I mean, it looks like an '82 Camaro to me, how much car is ahead of those front wheels. In the '82 Camaro, it was needless, but in this car, it served a purpose. It had to be, and we'll get into why when I pop the hood. But for the moment, we'll just sort of look at the rest of it. So you see it has this long, low-slung front end, which of course was extremely aerodynamic. This is the facelifted version that had sort of the angled composite headlamps and the wraparound bumpers that, helped it be even more aerodynamic. It had the fog lights up front, which I think looks great, a little air dam in the bottom, the aero wheels. This is definitely the pinnacle of 900 engineering. There you see that wraparound windshield, which takes some getting used to for the uninitiated into Saab, but is, it does serve an interesting purpose. The chassis itself at the body was designed using aircraft ideas, the same way they would build a fuselage. For instance, there's this 2-inch thick metal support which runs from the top of this header panel all the way down. In the 99, it was straight down into the bottom and gave it tremendous structural rigidity. You could drop the thing on its roof and it would barely notice. You push it back over and it would keep running. When they extended the front end, they had to move that forward a little bit, but it was still there. And that was a big part of the rigidity of the chassis, even in this convertible model. Going to the back, and I really wish this was a coupe for this, because it would have that hockey stick design coming up and going forward like that. With the convertible, of course, all of that is chopped off, but for Florida, it's kind of a cool thing too. The big sloping back end was part of the aerodynamic thing. The flush tail lights, very, very cool. The impact strip down the side. Again, those sort of composite bumpers, which look great. The Saab logo, the Scania logo with the gripping on there. There you see 900 turbo 16 valve. My dad's Saab, because he was such a cheap bastard, didn't have any of that. It just said Saab 900 on the back. So it was missing the turbo emblem, the 16 valve emblem, and the Scania emblem. But of course that was also in '84. But the design was absolutely unique, extremely aerodynamic, had extremely low drag, I'm not sure that's a word you can use anymore, but it had a low drag coefficient, and definitely appealed to the yuppies. One of the coolest parts of the Saab setup is under the hood, and particularly the engine. So let's get into that. We'll get into the trunk in a minute. We're going to do things differently. So I'm going to pop this here. And we're going to pull this forward. If I can find the release somewhere. There it is. And there we see one of the coolest clamshell hood designs in automotive history. I mean, that is really, really neat shit. And, you know, was a direct influence from their Scania division, the big truck division. This car, to a large extent, was built using the same technology that built their big trucks. It was the same advantage Mercedes had when designing their 80s cars. They relied heavily on their, you know, big truck technology, as did Saab. And this hood, this clamshell design, made it very, very easy for a mechanic to get in there and work on it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, or at least more interesting. The first Saabs used half of a Triumph engine, basically, a Dolomite V8. No, sorry, they used the Dolomite was a 4-cylinder, which they used. They ended up turbocharging it in the 99, which made it, and they made it reliable, which is incredible to make a British design reliable. This engine was half of a V8 engine, which is why it's slanted at a 45-degree angle, like the Chrysler Slant 6. So it's you know, again, Saab is just so weird. Here's where it gets weirder. The engine is backwards. As you can see, the V-belts are at the firewall, not at the front of the engine, which is what you'd expect, but at the back, which means the clutch is actually fairly easy to change in this car, maybe even easier than the V-belts. You see you've got this twin cam head. You've got the turbo. So here's the exhaust on the turbo going forward. I mean, going forward towards the radiator, where it goes into the turbo, makes this U-turn. It comes within 2 inches of the battery, which says it should be, you know, avoiding heat, and then makes its way to the back. I mean, nobody does this. But part of the reason Saab did this was they could mount the engine longitudinally instead of transversely, like most front-wheel drive cars. This motor would be sideways. Instead, this motor is, you know, front to back. That left the room for having a double wishbone suspension, which is the holy grail of handling. So it is one of the best handling front-wheel drive cars out there because it's able to use a double wishbone suspension up front. It's also why the overhang is so big, because the thing had to, you know, run fairly far forward. And it's just, again, nobody else was doing this but Saab. This also let them use a chain-driven gearbox, which was basically the bottom end of the engine. So the gearbox was sort of attached to the engine case, driven by a chain in the rear, and ran the length of the car from front to back. And it's just, again, you know, it's a silly kind of design, but it had tremendous meaning because it helped the car handle very, very well, which is why David E. Davis thought it would be a great car to avoid the cops in, particularly with the turbochargers. So all very fascinating under there. Also had disc brakes up front with ABS. It had independent suspension in the back, also with discs. And the car, you know, again, was a terrifically handling automobile. And you just absolutely have to love this bizarre clamshell hood, which I think is a big part of what makes this sort of an interesting classic today. In fact, I think it's really one of the great underappreciated classics in the car world. I would prefer a 4-door sedan or a 2-door coupe with the hatchback, but, you know, the convertible has its points too. There you see the trapezoidal grille, which was sort of a Saab signature. The angled headlamps composites look better than the early 80s version, this facelifted version, the Griffin hood ornament that it has. These are the aero rims, which look great. You've got all these impact strips down the side. You've got a nice little simple door pull handle. You got your fuel door there at the back, your flush tail lamps. We'll get into the trunk. There's a little clipper thing you lift up here. It has a nice big trunk area. Spare tire over here. You lift this thing up. You'd think that would be a good spot for a spare tire, but instead it's just a good spot for, you know, whatever you want to put in there. Children, babies, the Mac 10s, AR-15s. It's not very well finished, but, you know, you could put padding down there and make anybody happy. You also have a little toolkit here, which is very Saab-esque. I've never opened this, so let's see. Oh my God, it's not opening now. I'm scared to see what's in here. Yeah, it's good. You got, yeah, you got your pliers, you got your shit to remove the wheels, and, you know, all very Saab-esque. So let's get that back in. And there we go. So a nice big proper trunk, even on this convertible, which is just absolutely terrific. So I do have the top down. I ran that down earlier. It's got a very, very high-tech, over-engineered top cover, which is full of ABS plastic, but works great and looks terrific. So I tell you what, I'm going to pause there for a minute, and then we're going to get into the inside of the car, which also has its own engineering, interesting stuff, and we'll go from there. So bear with me. Hold on one moment. All right, so let's have a look inside. So, you know, this is a luxury car, so considered anyway, but I don't think Saabs in their natural state are true luxury cars. I think that was something that was sort of added for the American market later. I think basically they're utilitarian, practical cars designed for Scandinavian winters, designed to be popular in Scandinavia. And, you know, they just sort of took off elsewhere for whatever reason. And I think that's what happened in the 1980s. They presented a pretty good alternative to Mercedes and BMW for your college professor types with the tweed jackets who, you know, they just couldn't, they couldn't drive a Mercedes. It wouldn't have been proper for them. They had to find something else. And Volvos were too obvious. Saabs presented sort of a weird alternative that they liked, and the engineering quality of the Saab is what made it so good. I mean, you know, again, the guy who put this thing together wasn't really designing a car to a budget, but rather to a standard, much like the, you know, 70s and 80s Mercedes that it competed against in some small way. And the engineering is what made it interesting. One thing right off the bat you see is how tight the door sills are to the seat. You know, in fact, look at that. When you open the door sills go way in. Part of that was so that when you got out of the car in your pants, the snow from Scandinavia and the dirt wouldn't get on them. So it's as simple as that. You can also see it's very well fortified to be stiff and rigid, and of course it has to be even more so in the convertible. And that's why I think the 900 makes such a terrific classic car today, is it was designed to be rigid, solid, proper, you know, well engineered. It's as good as any 80s Mercedes in its own way, and has held up extremely well. But anyway, you see the door panels are quite simple, quite silly really. You just have one pull handle there, a little pull handle to close it, and you know, otherwise an insert on a very sort of nondescript Scandinavian door panel. You've got a map pocket down there, which is good for any degree of, you know, 9mm you could fit in there, a billy club, all kinds of weapons. Your Canadians in the back seats, they're going to be pretty chipper. It's built for two. They'll fit in there very properly. They'll be happy. You got a speaker there to make them happy. You got seat belts. They'll be chipper. There's shoulder belts in the back, which, you know, of course was a Saab safety thing back then. And everyone's going to be quite happy. Let's hop in and see what we got. All right, so you've got the steering wheel, which I find fascinating because it does not tilt or telescope. It is just in what appears to me to be this sort of full upright position. So if you don't like that, you better not buy the car. That's just the way the wheel is going to be. You do have an airbag, being a 93 model, not over on the passenger side, but over on the driver's side. You got little horn buttons there. You got a nice thick leather-wrapped steering wheel. You got all these vents. You've got a headlight switch. You've got your heated switch. Saab invented heated seats, by the way. They were the first. Here's your left side mirror control, which is irritating because the right side's over here. I'd really rather just have a switch left and right with one joystick, but yeah, it's the way Saab did it. You also have your fog light switch. You've got your turn signal lever, which, you know, doubles as a cruise control thing, which works. I tried it out. The gauges are the ultimate in simplicity. You've got your tachometer and clock over on the left. You've got your 125 mile an hour, 130 mile an hour speedo in the middle. You got your APC, automatic protection control. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it was Saab also revolutionized. They were the first to have knock sensors, so you could run low octane fuel in this car, and the timing and the engine would adjust to it in a way it wouldn't in like a Porsche 930. You had to run high octane all the time. Saab developed something that would be standard on every car in the future, and that is the ability to run low octane gas without hurting the engine. You also have your fuel gauge and your temp gauge, which is all great. Somebody gave this one the Alpine Touch. It would have come with a Clarion stereo back in the 90s, which is great, but obviously they wanted a CD or a USB for their iPod, and you know, it's an Alpine, so you just leave it in. You know, all the controls are up high. The dash is designed by airplane engineers to be a wraparound sort of, you know, people weren't doing this then. They're doing it now, but they weren't doing it then. All of the controls were designed to be within easy reach, within easy sight, and that was again part of the Saab mystique. You know, the radio was way up high where you could adjust it. In the Corvette, when this car came out in '78, it was way down low. I mean, you had to look down to do it. Not so in this car. You know, everything was just the switch gear, and you know, everything's so standardized now. You get in a car, it has the same switch gear as any other car. This, like a Mercedes, had very unique and interesting switchgear that was just designed for Saab. So here's your air conditioning, your recirc, your lighter, your rear defrost, and your hazards. This is your climate control. It's all very nice. You get over into the glove box, you got your owner's manual. This one has the USB shit for the Alpine, and what appear to be two places to rest cups. Saab in the 80s and obviously the 90s didn't feel it was necessary to have any sort of cup holders in the car at all. So I had a water with me yesterday and I had absolutely nowhere to put it. You know, like the Germans, apparently the Swedes think it's rude to have a cup with you as you're driving. So over here you've got your rear view mirrors. They're heated, they defrost, all very nice stuff. Just a very center, boring, normal, you know, center view mirror. No cocaine mirror on the left. You got one over there on the right. And, you know, everything looking proper and as it should be. You got an ashtray here because people still smoked then. This would have been an EQ in the upmarket radios. This one might have had one, but they put it in the storage compartment, and then a bigger storage compartment down here. Great place for a big Smith & Wesson revolver. You got your roof switch here, power roof it has. Here's your 5-speed gearbox, which was a bit of a Saab thing. To get the key out, you had to put it over into reverse. Once you pulled the key, it would not come out of reverse, and part of that was so that you know, some nitwit kid couldn't put it in neutral when he found it parked and let it roll down a hill. It would lock itself in reverse. There's your e-brake. Famously, Saab has the key between the seats. screwed up a lot of people. They did that for safety, because if the key was here on the side of the column, your knee in a collision might hit it, might really fuck up your knee. So instead they had it down there as a safety issue, and that's where it stayed. Also, these sort of irritating window switches down there, which don't make any sense. The wraparound windshield wasn't just for visibility like a fighter jet, but also in the event of a collision, you probably wouldn't go far forward enough to smash your face into it. And Saab also developed the first collapsible steering column for safety. So the car had a tremendous amount of engineering in it, and was appealing to sort of the nerdy academic types of the 80s in the United States and probably globally. So I tell you what, I'm going to pause there for a minute, and then we'll fire it up and go for a spin. So hold on one second. All right, let's go for a spin. So we're going to start it up in the traditional Saab fashion. Hear that 2-liter 4-cylinder fires to life. Nice smooth sound out of it. Get the seatbelt on. Forgive me for this. And again, you know, I should be using the GoPro on my head, as I've been told, but I just can't look that ridiculous. All right. And of course, Peter's gate is fast now, which is nice. And I cleaned up Dalton's windshield this morning. I've actually hired Dalton, so he's coming to work for Curious Cars. We'll have to see how that goes. It'll probably be the absolute death of me, but we're gonna try it. And let's see what we got. So I have to say, of all the cars manual cars I've driven with this camera, this one has made me the happiest in terms of being able to manage it. Nice old 126. You know, because again, the engineering is fantastic. Saab engineering really makes this a pretty fun car to drive. Shouldn't rev it out too much with the temperature down, but I mean, the handling is great. Again, that double wishbone, you know, it has new tires on it, so it's incredibly smooth. The brakes are fantastic. I absolutely bring the thing down quickly, and it's just a terrific car. That's why I think it's one of the best classic cars to own now. I mean, parts are out there. They're not, you know, hugely available, but they're available enough. And frankly, the build quality is good enough that the cars don't break too much. So it's just a terrifically fun car to drive. It's even nice having the top down, even if that really isn't my thing. And of course, you got airbags, you got crumple zones, you got great structural rigidity, you got all kinds of safety in the car. So you can have your classic car in a have your cake and eat it too kind of way, where you're still not, you know, you drive a 69 Camaro, that thing gets hit by a bus, you're doomed. This thing, you're probably going to survive. All right, so we got a little heat in the engine. Let's see what we got. Chirping second. Is that a fun car to drive, and it's smooth and effortless. I can absolutely see why people love this thing, myself included. So anyway, here we have a 93 Saab 900 Turbo Convertible, 67,000 miles. This is a real survivor. A lot of these cars are total pieces of shit. This one's actually pretty nice. So if you have an interest, it's going to be for sale at Autohaus. You can give those guys a call, 239-263-8500, on the web at autohausnaples.com. Might also run it on Bring a Trailer, but we'll see. So thanks again. We'll have some more fun stuff coming up. Really appreciate you having a look, and we will see you with the next one. Take care.